It was a safe place for us.
It was really a picture for black people to be proud of.
What happened in the Central Avenue area impacted Hillsborough County.
Ultimately, I see Central Avenue as being contested part of Tampa. Memories are contested, the land has been kind of contested. Central Avenue in some ways lived and died with segregation.
If you look to your left and you see the grassy area, the Great Lawn at Perry Harvey Park, that's where all the businesses were. From the 1890s until 1974, when the last business closed, there were over 100 businesses, most black-owned, running north and south through the middle of this park. That was Central Avenue.
Central Avenue was my world. It spanned from Cass down to Henderson. 7 or more blocks of all black businesses, and everybody knew that I was Mr. Joyner's daughter.
When you think of Central Avenue, you think of Harlem Nights. You think of good times. There was a lot of clubs, a lot of eating places, and it was a time for where black folks had fun. It was our New York City.
If there was parade that was predominantly black, it went down Central Avenue. In fact, everything went through some Central Avenue. At a point, if there was a funeral in West Tampa, on the way to the cemetery, they would come through Central Avenue. It was really the center of the black community.
Going in the various restaurants and stores, and especially the Lincoln Theater movie house, where we all felt like kings and queens. During the days of segregation, there were many places we could not go. We could not go to the white theaters. We couldn't go to the white restaurants and sit down and have a hamburger or whatever. And so there was a certain feeling that, am I really wanted here? They would accept our money, but we couldn't sit down and eat with other people. So that didn't happen on Central Avenue.
For us, that was told that we can't go other places. It didn't bother us because, again, we had our very own. It was about ownership. It was good to see African-American business owners, like Mr. Joyner that owned the Cotton Club, Mr. Rodriguez, Attorney Rodriguez, who was a lawyer there. During that era, they realized that their way out of poverty was owning their own business.
What it represented was the exposure of what it was like to be an entrepreneur. It was part of your life. So you grew up saying, hey, I can be anything, because everything is here.
One of the sort of ironic effects of the physical segregation of peoples is the creation of these black communities, black business districts especially, that again only exist because of the inability of black people to move freely in the white community.
I think you can reflect the racism existed very strongly in this town. Black people couldn't have jobs of any significance back during that period of time. And the few, even on Central Avenue, there were 1 or 2 people that were white. The drugstore was white-owned and run.
Tampa was in many ways a typical Southern segregated town. But to be honest with you, we were very comfortable in that surrounding. We made the best of what life had given us.
The larger context here would be the sort of the movement from the Jim Crow system, which is in place across the South, including Florida, since really the turn of the 19th into the 20th century is when you get the rise of segregation statutes, the disfranchisement of African American voters, and the sort of rise of racial violence in the form of lynching.
What we're talking about when we talk about the long struggle for civil rights is the fact that the struggle for the equality of African Americans in this country actually began in the 1920s and 1930s, and some would even say it goes all the way back to Reconstruction.
Well, what Tampa was like when I was growing up, of course it was in the 1940s. It was the Jim Crow era in the South, and so it was a very segregated world. But it was also a very protected world. And that's the world that I grew up in. I understood that the difference between the white fountain and the one that said colored. I know that if I wanted to eat downtown, that was an impossibility.
You had segregation, you got on the bus, you had to ride back of the bus. Going to school, I had to walk about 3 miles to school. There was no school bus available to me.
During the Jim Crow years, there were very limited venues for Black people. There are very few places where people could feel safe. So really, it was not just about surviving, but it was about thriving, despite whatever kinds of racial terror that existed at that time.
World War II is an important turning point in terms of African American activism and agitation. One historian has called World War II veterans the shock troops of the modern civil rights movement. So these people go to fight for freedom overseas, and then they come home and say, you know, we're fighting for democracy overseas. What about democracy here at home? It's called the Double V campaign for double victory. Victory over fascism abroad, victory over Jim Crow at home.
You begin to see the desegregation of the military in 1948 by Harry Truman. That's another instance in which the media as a whole, both African American and the white media, see as a seminal and salient event. And then you move into Brown versus Board. But really, when the white press begins to really understand movements and begin to understand that struggle and begin to recognize that it's an issue, you begin to see that in the 1950s with the Montgomery bus boycott. And with the Little Rock Nine.
Hank Klivanoff, co-author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Race Beat, he talks about this in terms of the white press, and particularly the New York Times. The white press started following the story in the South. There was just too much going on to avoid and ignore the story anymore. And once the television crews started showing up, things began escalating from there, both in terms of the movement and the power of the movement.
Brown versus Board of Education decision had been made, and it was pretty obvious in the late 1950s that civil rights was inevitable, that it was going to happen, that there was going to be integration coming to Tampa. And so Elder Banfield got some other Black ministers and Black leaders together. The Wilk brothers got some of the white business leaders together and ministers in the community. And that was the beginning of the Mayor's Biracial Committee.
The Mayor's Biracial Committee officially was organized in 1959. Cody Fowler became very interested in it. The Wilk brothers spoke to him. Cody Fowler for many years was an attorney, perhaps the first white attorney to, on a regular basis, take the cases of Black people who needed legal advice. He was known for that all the way back to the 1920s.
So the Biracial Committee consisted of people like Cody Fowler, Robert Thomas, who headed Port Tampa. Merchants Association was interested because they didn't want business disrupted. On the Black side, you had people like the Reverend A. Leon Lowry, who was a prominent, probably the most prominent minister in Tampa, and an NAACP leader. You had Perry Harvey Sr., who was head of the Longshoremen's Union. C. Blythe Andrews Sr., who was the publisher of the Florida Sentinel Bulletin.
So locally, the editors often were involved in local politics. They could dig up information. And in a way, it attempted to not only inform readers, but it attempted to pressure local officials, right, to try to change the situation.
Everybody respected Reverend Lowry. He was truly a leader, and Perry Harvey. They were people who negotiated, who was strong, who stood up and spoke up for us. And as a student, we knew that this group was out negotiating to make it happen. They were working for the good of this community. They wanted Tampa to do it the right way.
They were people who were willing to take some risk, but calculated risk, if you will. And so to avoid, I guess, making mistakes, or doing things too fast. I think there was just this methodical working through what do we think will happen if we do this, or how fast should we move with that.
But this is very much by design. Commercial elites of the city recognizes that disruption is bad for business, and that if measured, cautious integration is better than disruption and unrest. So this comes to be called the Tampa Technique.
The Tampa Technique, which was a process by which whites and blacks leaders cooperated with each other to try to control the pace and development of racial and civil rights progress. And they viewed Tampa as a New South, what was termed New South city, in which there would be business development, real estate, of course, and finally tourism.
There was an attempt to seize the moment. So, you know, they're willing to listen. Let's try to see what we can do to make improvements without causing a whole lot of problems, without, you know, without necessarily making extraordinary demands.
On February 1st, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, several students at North Carolina A&T University, there were 4 of them initially, who went to an F.W. Woolworth department store downtown, just as we had one here in Tampa on Franklin Street. They sat at the lunch counter. They were not served. They were refused service, but they just kept coming back, and they kept coming back, and they kept coming back, and then more students joined them.
Well, that's what sparked our interest here. I say they were some courageous young men. They were all college students there, and when it hit the news, television, the newspapers, and then I thought about our situation here. I said, well, why not us? Why don't we get involved?
One of the truly significant things about the sit-in movement is that it's students for the first time who are young people who are going to be at the center of that particular branch of civil rights activism. The NAACP has been working for decades at this point. You have Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So if the NAACP is the lawyers and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the ministers, the sit-in movement is going to be the students.
Clarence Ford was a 20-year-old barber from Alachua County, from Hawthorne, Florida, who had come to Tampa looking for a way to make a good life for himself. And because he was a barber, he was independently employed. So he didn't have to worry about his boss firing him or getting in any trouble because he was stirring up trouble, so to speak. But it was Clarence Ford that took that very important first step.
When the sit-in came in February 29th, 1960, it gave the Biracial Committee really its first major challenge. Now, part of the reason that you'll see the sit-in in Tampa is that the impetus from the original sit-ins came from youth council members of the NAACP. Through a variety of ways, kind of a network of communications, those in Tampa got the idea to carry on the sit-ins in downtown Tampa, first against Woolworths and then against Woolworths and Crests.
Well, I sat down and wrote out my plan, and then I turned it over to Robert Saunders at the NAACP office and told him, see, the only way we can get it done, I'm going to go out to the high schools and meet with the presidents of the student councils and let them recruit some kids.
And my husband, the late George Edgecombe, Hillsborough County's first African-American judge, was at the time the president of the student body at Middleton High School. And so 2 of the crucial people that were part of that sit-in were the presidents of the student body at Blake and at Middleton, which were the premier high schools, or the only high schools at the time in Tampa for African Americans.
That was in February of 1960. I was in 11th grade. Clarence Ford came to Middleton and talked to George and organized us to participate. He is actually the living embodiment of a true organizer and one who sought out the students to come so that we too would have a part in this historic event.
In watching television, and I saw what happened at some of the other cities around the South, I really didn't know what to expect, but it was just one of the things that I felt I had to go through. I said to myself, whatever happened, it happened. I didn't know if I would get beaten. I don't know if they would bring the dogs.
We went and sat, and they immediately closed the counter, and people stared and looked, and under their breath, said a few things, but we engaged each other and just sat there and asked for service, but we didn't get it. We were nonviolent, orderly students addressing our grievance to Tampa and to the world.
One thing I give Tampa credit for, we had a very moderate mayor at the time. Tampa was really on the move, and they really didn't want that to happen.
And it's at this point that the Biracial Committee and the mayor decided that they would need to do something to prevent any violence from taking place, because in some of these other cities there would be violence.
Because of the support of Mayor Julian Lane, there was very little violence in Tampa. Now, there had been violence in other places, and we began to see more and more of this on the 6 o'clock news in Birmingham and many other places. There was very little violence in Tampa.
The city fathers got together, the Biracial Committee, and they got me in a meeting and asked me if I would agree to give them time to work it out. And I just told them that I didn't know how long I could hold the kids off. So they assured me that they were working on it and give them time to work out a peaceful solution with the merchants.
Well, we never knew what the people who were in charge would do. But we did what we had to do. We sat in and demanded things change. And I was a part of working very closely with Clarence Ford.
So in September, what we did not use the children from the schools to integrate. We used James Hammond's group, the young adults for progressive action. We wanted more older people. We wanted professional people. And we decided that every store in the city that had lunch counters, we would send 2 people in to eat on a trial basis at 10 in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And what we did, we got away from the rush hour. We didn't want a lot of fanfare when there were a lot of people around.
So the Tampa Technique is the way that the sit-in process is negotiated, the way that the desegregation of the downtown area commences. But it's also, I think, really important to recognize that it's also packaging on the part of the city fathers and the commercial elite, right? This is not just out of the goodness of their hearts. This has to do with money. This has to do with bringing people to Tampa. And the Tampa Technique becomes a way that the city presents itself to investors, to the state, people outside the city. It's sort of the notion of, look what we're able to do, look what we did here.
Now, Florida, in the late 50s, very early 60s, was lucky to have Governor Leroy Collins, who was certainly not a desegregationist. He was not an integrationist, but he was a moderate. If you compare that to governors like George Wallace, it's a whole different state leadership here.
The Biracial Committee began as a local response, but then it became a statewide response because Governor Leroy Collins made a really important speech March 20th, 1960, where he's responding to all these sit-ins that are happening. And basically, there's people on both sides of the racial aisle asking him to just take a hard line. You can hear the frustration in his voice.
Well, I want to talk to you about race relations. Now, none of us have all the answers to this situation, friends. I think all of us are part right and part wrong, because when there's division, there's suspicion, that there is fear, there's distrust, and ultimately there's hate. And hate consumes and destroys. We've got extremists on one side, and we've got extremists on the other. But where are the people in the middle? Why aren't they talking? Why aren't they working? They must start working.
There were still businesses, the movie theaters, for instance, bowling alleys, swimming facilities, cafeterias that didn't desegregate voluntarily.
After sit-ins, we moved to the theaters. Then the beaches, we had wait-in. But I can remember a time down at the Tampa Theater on Franklin Street. We tried to get interest there, and the clerk had to tell us, because of our policies, I cannot sell you a ticket. We had 20 people in line, 20 students, and she had to tell every one of us that. So after she finished with that, she quit. She quit her job. She told the manager, you come do it, I'm not going to do it.
The process of gaining equality in many, many different areas was always gradual, if you will. First of all, it's about a system, a historic system that's sort of grounded in people's minds and in people's hearts. So, and that takes a lot to change.
What was really an important part of what I saw growing up in education in Hillsborough County at the time, it was teachers who understood that at some point in time the world was going to change. They probably would not have predicted when and how, but there was this kind of commitment to getting us ready for whatever that change was going to be.
Those are the people, along with my parents, who pushed me. And they made me do right, and they said, you can be anything you want to be. They took a personal interest in each and every one of us. We got nurtured by our teachers and attention, and they made sure that we got our work done.
If you had to do the tier system, you'd say Blake and Middleton was at the bottom because they're all black. And then Jefferson, which is a small school, had a lot of Hispanics. And then you would have your Hillsborough and your Plant during that time.
It was a very difficult problem because it was hard to do it immediately, since black education had been, for the most part, underfunded. Education was separate, but it was never equal in the South.
You have to consider that 1963 was really a very eventful year, and it made such a tremendous impact. Of course, we had President John Kennedy come to Tampa, and for me, I heard him say, "Now, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And that was in 8th grade at Just Junior High School.
And here at home, what we're trying to do is also simple, though its execution is difficult. And that is to educate our children so that they are able to maintain themselves and their families and this free system. I believe it is the united will of all of our people, protecting the security of the United States and providing an opportunity for our people. That's what we stand for.
So this little 13-year-old girl went home and told my mother, I'm gonna leave Just and go over to West Tampa Junior High School. My mother kept saying to me, why you?
If you've got a strong support system and you have people who are behind you, encouraging you and inspiring you and telling you why this was important to do, I think you felt safe in doing it. You certainly had your fears. Being a teenager is a difficult time anyway, and just couple that with a change in your learning environment, going into something that's absolutely strange. It wasn't like you had a lot of knowledge about what this was all about because it was a new phenomenon for this country.
I left 8th grade, all black schools segregated Just, to go to West Tampa, and there was 3 of us that left Just. Henry Lee White, myself, and Patricia Killens. And we went there, and it was a big adjustment. It was a rude awakening.
We had the first 2 white teachers to teach at Middleton High School in East Tampa when I was in 11th grade. And prior to that, all of the students were black, all the teachers were black, the principal, all the administrators. And if you lived in a segregated neighborhood, you didn't see white people on a regular basis.
That was a long time after Brown versus Board of Education, but schools were segregated even up until I graduated from high school, and I graduated from Tampa Catholic in 1969.
Horrible time, and the time that really made me realize prejudice and racism and just could kill your spirit was when they closed Jefferson down in 1967, and I went to Hillsborough High School in '68. You realize it wasn't just about black and white or Hispanic, it's about economics. And Hillsborough and Plant High School was the 2 upper class where all the money was.
Opening up schools in Hillsborough County, after 1969, that had consequences for the black community that not all people saw. Some did. If you're going to merge school system, what's going to happen to the teachers and principals and administrators in the black schools? And the schools themselves were real sites of community pride.
It was what we knew. You know, it's kind of interesting when people ask us to compare. I can do that now because having been in education for 52 years, I could definitely see the big differences, the contrast. But at the time, it was all that I know. It was natural. It was expected. It was all that was available at the time.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to take this occasion to talk to you about what that law means to every American. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
Okay, so by 1964, I think Tampa had sort of been gradually moving toward some kind of equality. Tampa was just like any other city, not so much in terms of violence. We didn't have dramatic violence like in other southern cities. But I think that there are a lot of different ways that Tampa could show itself as the South.
What the white civic leaders had worked for was the threat of a Civil Rights Act. They were working to avoid the passage of federal legislation because they could not design how that federal legislation would work, or they couldn't control what it did.
Civil Rights Acts, in terms of how it played itself out in Tampa, was a greater sense of freedom about being able to operate in this environment now. You have to remember that it's interesting, blacks knew more about whites than whites knew about blacks. And so we were still kind of a mystery in some ways.
What happens in this post-civil rights moment? And there's this expectation, I think, among much of the white population that civil rights is now done. That, right, we have the Civil Rights Act, we have the Voting Rights Act. That is over, let's move on. And what African American communities across the urban United States in the late 1960s are saying, in a lot of cases, is no, we're not done. There are still issues to be addressed.
I don't feel that in the areas of housing there were major transformations until much later.
Central Park Village was built in 1955. It replaced the scrub, at least in that area between Orange Avenue and Nebraska Avenue. So the scrub went away, all these wood frame homes that were barely standing, many of them that had been sitting there 60, 70 years, they went away. Public housing came into that area, Central Park Village.
Everything that existed for white people in their communities existed right there in Central Avenue, and right behind Central Avenue was Central Park Village housing projects.
After World War II, there's a lot of federal dollars available for housing. You see Tampa taking this money and using it for Progress Village. So I think the strategy was that Tampa would spend federal dollars on black constituents. Local money would still, for the most part, go towards the wealthier communities.
The area east of Nebraska Avenue, where Maryland Avenue was, and that Maryland Avenue project, that was the first time in the history of the city of Tampa that African American-led organizations actually were able to participate in redevelopment.
A number of scholars have written about how urban renewal, the interstate system, and again, federal home mortgages were used to break up these minority enclaves. That's where you get the definition of these areas being designated as slums and slum removal and so on, and this was the problem.
Progress Village was born, and they were trying to find a place to relocate African Americans that was in that part of the city. And in other parts of the city where the interstate went through, like West Tampa, Culver City, places like that. And they created Progress Village.
And the people who moved to Progress Village were those who were being displaced because of urban redevelopment, the changing of highway patterns through the city. And So they set this up as a model community. It was a segregated community. There was not interracial housing back then.
It helped to reproduce what we talk about, a number of social differences in terms of who gets displaced, who has power, who has the right to the city.
Basically, urban renewal, which seemed like a good idea initially, but really it ended up being a strategy for moving Black people out of the city and really kind of pushing them to move into areas that were designated as Negro areas.
The interstate system came in mid-60s. It was during President Eisenhower's administration. During World War II, he saw in Germany this Autobahn system where you have high-speed roadways that connect cities. When the roadway gets to a major urban center, it's a beltway around the center. And if you want to visit within that urban center, use local roads. So that was the original thinking around it until politics reared its ugly head.
The major highways that are built through a lot of downtown areas tend to target minority communities, which from the perspective of urban planners, these are classified as slums. From the perspective of residents, they are thriving communities and business areas.
The highway construction that was going to, open up Tampa to more rapid commerce and transportation came at a loss for the poorest, the victims of a system that had kept them out of the economic and political development of this country.
That was this level of displacement that was combined with urban renewal programs that came along a few years later. And you have to remember during this time, a lot of legislation that we take for granted was not in the books. The Interstate Highway System Act preceded the Civil Rights Act by 8 years.
In a lot of ways, we were witnessing the demise of the community. Also, there were other opportunities that opened up so that geographically, we had access to places that we hadn't before.
I guess the interstate for the community as a whole, what's saying is symbolic of progress. Now we've got this way we can travel faster and quicker and that kind of thing. But it really destroyed many of our community, African American communities, split them up. People had to move to other places. It was the demise from many African American communities. It was, death, if you will.
Civil rights movement of the early 1960s obviously accomplished an extraordinary amount for African Americans across the United States, but there's an awful lot that is left undone.
The Biracial Committee didn't just close up shop, it actually evolved into a city agency called the Commission on Community Relations. That was, in effect, the outgrowth of the Biracial Committee. And it was headed by Jim Hammond.
Jim Hammond started a program that preceded Head Start. Before there was a Head Start program, federal program, Jim Hammond had a program doing the same kinds of things with very young children. He was the representative of Black people to the power structure for several years in the 1960s.
The city of Tampa was a racist city, and Black folks basically had only menial kind of jobs, nothing significant. And one of my responsibilities, I took it on to give people to hire Black folks.
When it comes to African American constituents, Tampa provided nothing. No parks, no health care, no special education programs, nothing to the African American community. The Urban League and other volunteer community organizations had to fill in the gap.
They couldn't see a way out of their situation because everybody they knew was in the same condition they were in. And living in public housing in Central Park Village, it was a hill to climb.
And what's particularly interesting, just at the height of the civil rights success, just when Americans were congratulating themselves, white Americans in particular, that they had done the right thing by ending, by law, desegregation. It's at that very moment that in the summer of 1964, 1964 and the summer of 1965, there was an explosion of racial agitation.
In Newark, New Jersey, it happens in Detroit, it happens in Watts in Los Angeles, California, but it doesn't happen here because this is progressive Tampa. This is the city of the Tampa Technique. The 1967 riot shows that the negotiated agreements of the early 60s leave a lot undone, and I think that's a really important point.
At June 11th of '67, I had just come back to work. My partner and I was riding in Ybor City. The call came out that there had been a burglary down south of Kennedy Boulevard, down in the warehouse area. Some young guys, and they were running back towards Central Park Project.
Newspaper accounts, we've been able to find quite a few of those stories from that era. Talked about what happened on that June day when Martin Chambers, who was 19 years old, and some other young men, and we really can't tell you a lot about those other young men who were involved in this situation, but Martin was running away from a burglary. That's all we really know. He was trying to get back home to his apartment in Central Park Village, and Officer Jim Calvert fired one single shot, shot Martin in the back.
We were the first vehicle to arrive around on Short Harrison Road. They had called an ambulance, and the ambulance they said they couldn't find where we were. This reporter from the Florida Sentinel, Reverend Newman, was there, and he said, look, don't let this kid die out here on the street. Get him in the police car and get him to the hospital right away. So the officer that had shot him drove the police car, and the other officer, Robert Oates, who was there, he was in the back seat holding him. And they got him in the car and they drove him to Tampa General Hospital. My partner and I got his mother in our car, and we followed them and took her over to Tampa General.
What actually happened is always hard to say, but the policeman shot him. Just as the sit-ins were part of a communication network and people saw things now on television, as a result, in this hot night, word spread.
A crowd gathered around, of course, to see what was going on, and people were very upset. Some people said he had his hands raised, he was giving up. Some people said he was trying to climb over a fence. He was just trying to get away. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have anything that was a danger to anybody else. But he was shot, he did die, and there were 3 days and nights of civil disturbances.
We heard the news, on TV about a young black guy got shot in the back. Say he was running from the police, and the police shot him in the back. And next thing we know is a big uproar, with riots and things like that, where people was saying he was unjust shot.
We left Tampa General several hours later. The riot was in full force, buildings were burning, and incidents were happening all over Central Avenue at that time.
All hell broke loose, and these guys just start tearing up everything they could tear down, blow up, just tear down in Tampa.
I guess I felt like most African Americans at the time, the sense of injustice, a little bit some fear. Was this going to take us back? What's it going to do to our communities? Because unfortunately, the riots and all the devastation and destruction occurred in the black community, which was always, for me, a sad kind of commentary that what was being destroyed was our own property in our community, kind of thing.
The looting and the burning and not knowing the uncertainty of what was happening over there at Central Avenue, it was like a shock to all of us. Because again, for the protest that was going on, we were burning up our own businesses. And you still see that sometimes today, okay? But most people felt they had no other outlet, that the systems and the powers to be was not listening to the blacks of this community.
Essie Mae Reed told me that she remembered the day that Martin was shot and killed. He had 27 cents in his pocket. And that was not unusual. These kids didn't have anything. Their parents, were just barely getting by. The state attorney's office ruled it justifiable homicide. State Attorney Antonori made that ruling, and so people were very, very, very upset.
Nothing was done to these guys. That was the time that white people could do anything they wanted to do to black people, and basically nothing happened. And this was the role that I played to make things happen, change, and I didn't give a damn, really.
They called in the troops. The National Guard was activated, came in to help secure the city, and things calmed down for a while. But what really calmed down the riots was when they organized James Hammond and some of the other leaders in the community organized a group called the White Hats.
And I was able to get the city to allow me to buy the white hats. I guess there were about 20 hats, and they had these guys identified as the white hats. And they wore hats so the white cops wouldn't shoot them. And then I got the mayor to get me in charge of really manning this whole situation.
The motivation was to try to keep the peace, try to keep any more people from getting hurt, and basically try to keep people from tearing up properties.
We had 4 buildings that were burned down on Central Avenue. A lot of those businesses closed and never reopened. But we did have a group of young men who became known as the White Hats. And many of them had actually participated in some of the violence on Central, but they became the problem solvers and the ambassadors for peace, the White Hats.
They created the White Hats and James Hammond and that group and came together to bring about some peace and quell a disturbance, because it was not a peaceful time in this community.
Clearly, the Tampa Technique had not prevented this kind of violence from occurring. The Tampa Technique was good at diffusing confrontations, but the people who were involved in the confrontations were connected to those who wanted to resolve those problems. The riot was something outside of that system.
When you had any kind of racial strife during that period, the press itself begins to cover the story. And what tends to happen is that the mainstream press covers it as a singular event, and that's where we begin to have problems, because it doesn't show what were the issues that led up to that event and that sort of forced that event to occur.
You could say that a lot of the media did something similar to what they're doing now, right? They parachute in, they get the story, and then they leave. Some outlets did a better job than others of providing some context. The Nation magazine did a fabulous job actually in the 1960s.
I challenge people to go back and take a look at the Kerner Commissioner report.
In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson creates a commission to study this urban unrest across the United States. It's headed by a guy named Otto Kerner.
To look into, what's the cause of this and what's behind it. And it's a number of the issues that were never addressed that we still see today.
They produced this list of causes. It's police violence, it's lack of educational opportunities, it's lack of employment opportunities, it's substandard living conditions, a lack of availability of housing, it's lack of recreational facilities.
One thing that the riots did for Tampa, it sort of exposed the ugly parts of the city. The poverty, the poor health conditions, the living conditions, the fact that these young people were just kind of left to fend for themselves.
The rearing of the head of mistrust, again, that maybe this community had been working hard to overcome, and this incident was kind of an impetus to moving it back to a place that we worked so hard to move from.
We need to understand these explosions of urban racialized violence throughout the late 1960s as these are political acts, right? These are not random acts of violence. These are people denied a formal sort of stake in the political process, effectively disfranchised, who are making their voices heard in an alternative sort of way.
So between the riot, integration, and the interstate coming through, that pretty much sealed the death knell for Central Avenue. And this all happened in the late 1960s.
Once that competition began, after integration, then it was really an unfair struggle from then on for most black businesses. So Central Avenue, essentially by the late 60s, was the shell of its former self.
People were thinking about closing their businesses anyway because of urban renewal and because of the highway coming through. So there was a lot going on that sort of spelled the demise of the area.
The black world that had been contained within Central Avenue it branched out, and people were going other places and doing things. And then with all of the destruction that occurred, and that all contributed to the decline of Central Avenue. And then the next thing you know is the interstate. And the exit to downtown at Jefferson and Scott was where Central Avenue was. That was it. It just wiped out everything.
The interstate hurt Central Avenue a lot because it wiped out a good bit of the residential areas that supported Central Avenue. And when you take out the residents, hey, you got no support.
African Americans may have lived in those enclaves and owned their homes. You had eminent domain. You know, if the city says that this is the benefit of the greater good, again, you're in the South, what voice do you have to fight City Hall if they, so the businesses were lost, the homes were lost. We know within that area over 3,000 structures were displaced.
It was devastating because we lost that rich history, that safe place for many of us to go to. We lost the wealth of the businesses and the business owners during that time.
Couldn't compensate for the years of living in community and all of the goodness and the goodwill and all that Central Avenue had brought forth, the camaraderie, the community, all of that was devastated.
We have never been able to recapture in this community that same sense of unity, of family, of being very supportive of each other. We're still struggling with that today.
As a whole, we're not moving forward the way that we could when we had a district. Bought everything we needed there, except an automobile. That's the only thing they didn't sell on Central Avenue. So, but I think we can learn from the successes of those people who built Central Avenue if we know more about their story. And the park is a good place to start.
But we welcome you to a place of dreams where children's voices romp and scream, for what surrounds us now in stone was a wonder once of flesh and bone.
Just the fact that we've got a park named after Perry Harvey and a park that's sort of geared towards African American history is really remarkable when you consider the long view of Tampa's history and the fact that parks were never something that was sort of given to the African American community. A demonstration of a complete change from the way Tampa operated before, say before 1960.
I try and get through there once or twice a month. I do have a picture of portrait there in the park of me sitting at the lunch counters under the civil rights history of Tampa. They have one space for that. It's a nice park. I don't know how well it's attended.
A wonderful exhibition of our history and people who made a difference long before many of these young folks were born. It gives them a smidgen, a little knowledge about what it was like. But they have a responsibility to read and find out and talk to people who lived during that era.
I'm interested in how people use it. I'm interested in how it teaches people about Tampa's African American history. Is it meant to do that? Or is it meant to portray itself as honoring Black history, but really attracting people so that they can live in those apartments that are built there?
It's recognized, but is it taught? How does that history and that reconciliation get ingrained into how we do policing, how we do hiring in the city, how we tell that story every day? It's not something that somebody should have to go to Perry Harvey Park to see that.
People talk about a post-racial era, or they talk about color blindness, they talk about a lot of different things, but when people are still angry, when people are still upset over poverty issues or lack of health care, lack of education, and these issues are still going on, so it's absolutely critical, I believe, to understand the context in order to break these cycles and to break some of these structural and institutional racism.
Watching in recent years the incidences of racial unrest, most stemming from police brutality in Ferguson, Missouri with Michael Brown, and Baltimore with Freddie Gray. These moments where communities sort of rise up and protest against the sort of systematic, racialized violence. You know, to watch the popular press deal with this, there's a sense of where does this anger come from? And the answer is history. We have a instructive case in Tampa.
It just needs to be known what Central Avenue was like and how important it was to the black community and to the city of Tampa. It gave young people a sense of belonging and something to strive toward.
The creation of a community is about holding on to hope that there will be a brighter day. It's about self-sufficiency, self-determination. It's about creativity, and we need to know that.
Central Avenue should teach us a great lesson as black people as to what you can accomplish, what you can achieve when you work together.
They started out with a dream and a vision, and they worked hard. They made many sacrifices, but all these people never forgot their community. They always wanted to make it better for the next generation. They were proud African-American men and women.
That is better than any Hollywood movie could create, because no one would have thought in 1960 that Jim Crow was going to fall was not much different than South Africa was until Nelson Mandela could free it. We had our own Nelson Mandelas, and you look back and you say, wow, these folks did that.
I think when they look at what we did, and it's important for us to keep it in the limelight or to keep it out there in front of them so that they can see where there's struggle, there's gain, and there's no gain without struggle.
So I think it's very important for people to recognize that and to recognize from which we have come.
And I think our students, both black and white, even our community, ought to know about Central Avenue and what it meant in that period of time and the history of it and the implications of what happened to it, so that we're careful that as we talk about redevelopment, as we talk about expanding opportunities in Tampa, that the mistakes aren't made so the same fate won't occur again.
Well, 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 that was amazing. I am so excited to introduce to everyone Mr. Travis Bell. He is an assistant professor of digital and sports media. Just a second. Okay. I apologize for that. He is a professor of the digital and sports media in the Zimmerman School of Advertising and Mass Communication at the University of South Florida, which is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. His research focuses on sports media, primarily intersecting with health, gender, and race. Dr. Bell is lead author for CTE Media and the NFL 2009 Lexington Books. His interdisciplinary research appears in Journalism Practice, Communication in Sport, International Journal of Sport Communication, Sociology of Sport Journal, Journal of Sports Media, and Howard Journal of Communication. The documentary that we just viewed, the Tampa Technique documentary, was produced as his dissertation project for his PhD from USF and highlights the community engaged projects he also produces as a part of his research. Let us welcome to the panel, Dr. Travis Bell, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully enjoyed the film. I look forward to speaking with you all, taking questions, and just kind of talking through the process. So I appreciate you all's interest in the project, first and foremost, just to continue telling the story of Central Avenue.
And we want to thank you for taking the time out to be with us tonight. I'm going to reintroduce my executive director, Dr. Felita Lewis, and she's going to start with some discussion questions. And I see we have a few Q&A questions in our chat right now. So I'm going to turn this part of our session over to Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Angela, and welcome, Dr. Bell. We're pleased to have you on our Parent Academy tonight. And I have to tell you that I'm simply in awe with this amazing film, and I certainly hope that the other participants are as moved as I was viewing this film. Kudos to you. What an amazing production. So I'm going to lead us into the Q&A, and I do have 3 questions for you tonight as it specifically relates to your film. So as you are aware, the 2021 Black History Month theme is the Black family, representation, identity, and diversity. So as we reflect on this year's theme, there's no doubt that your film here that we view tonight touches on various forms of representation, identity, and diversity, or the lack thereof. So please, if you will, for us, Dr. Bell, tell us about your path to the Tampa Technique. Who or what inspired you to produce such an analytical documentary that truly walked us through the formation and the change and the growth that led to the civil rights movement here, right here in our backyards in Tampa, Florida?
Sure. Well, again, I just, I appreciate the platform to sort of share the story of Central Avenue, what I learned in this journey of putting this film together. I don't really know that I have like a key pinpoint moment, right? I think it's always, I think the desire to really sort of unpack ideas of diversity and identity have to start somewhere. So I guess if it sounds kind of crazy, I would say the origin of this project started with an 8th grade research project about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In a history course that I was taking. And ever since that class and writing an in-depth sort of research paper about Dr. King and learning about the civil rights movement, that's probably where I can maybe trace the origin to. I didn't know where that interest would take me or where it might resurface, and Central Avenue was the place where it resurfaced. Specifically for this film, I think the interesting intersection in trying to unpack a lot of those sort of identity labels and what you were introducing as the complexity of it. My original interest in doing a film was to tell the story of the 1967 civil disturbance, the death of Martin Chambers, and really start to try to understand that kind of within the context of what our nation was seeing. This was produced in 2017, or it was ultimately completed in 2017. And that would have been the 50-year anniversary of Martin Chambers' death. And so my original intent and goal was to produce a film about that and to have it unveiled on the 50th anniversary of when he passed. But in researching those events of 1967, it became way more complex to understand how we got to that moment, right? And I think it's important for all of us to think about that. You know, how did we get to the summer of 2020? Well, it took a lot of other things that led to sort of that culminating moment. And so that's, in researching for that particular project, that's when I really started to learn about Central Avenue and its significance to Tampa. And that then started me on this big journey, this quest to learn more about Central Avenue, try to think through a way to almost visually recreate the space for people who don't know what it looked like. I didn't know. I'm not originally from Tampa. I moved here in 2006, so it was an interesting journey where I learned a ton. I can't thank Fred Hearns and Cheryl Rodriguez enough for helping me get this project started. They were the first two people that I really spoke in depth with about, and they're wonderful advocates, amazing people, just a wealth of knowledge. And so I have to give a shout out and credit to them for helping me get this project underway. So it was a great journey. I've learned a lot. I've still learned a lot, and continued to try to learn more.
Well, thank you. And that helps us to really wrap our minds around what maybe some of your biggest takeaways were as you were leading and guiding this production. I'm not sure if you can respond to this one, but tell us what might someone who's either from Tampa or resides in Tampa might be surprised to hear that you discovered through the interviewing of the residents and the anthropologists or the historians that you might not have been able to capture in depth through this documentary itself.
Sure. I think the first takeaway, sadly, is the lack of knowledge, even that a lot of people who are from Tampa know, like that there is no knowledge of Central Avenue, right? When I say, hey, do you know about Central Avenue? And they're like, oh, that's the place in St. Pete, right? Because Central Avenue still exists or exists in a physical space in St. Pete. For me, the biggest takeaway that I've had in screenings and conversations is I had no idea that this place existed, and I had no idea that this history was situated in Tampa. And for me, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways is that the story that we saw of Central Avenue is part of and is an exemplar of the systemic issues that have been in place in this country for centuries, and they don't just stop when a bill is passed, right? And they don't just change with the snap of a finger. And so I think for me, that's one of the things that I'm always trying to talk through. I will say, especially with white people, is why is it important to know the story of Central Avenue? Well, because it was the demise of a space through a lot of bills and laws that were passed prior to the Civil Rights Act that most people elevate as this the key seminal moment for equality, right? At least in sort of the white purview, that's the perception a lot of times. So thinking through those challenging ideas of interstate construction and how the highway system worked prior to all of those moments to displace largely people of color who at that time had very little recourse in any way. Those are, I think, a few of the hopeful key takeaways that people learn and are able to kind of, have conversations with friends, family, with other people to really start to learn about the space and how this all worked.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And the last question that I do have for you, Professor, before we open it up to the other participants is, so taking us from the civil rights movement here in Tampa and everything that you've learned in putting together this production to our current social climate, where do you see room for growth in our greater Tampa Bay community as a whole?
Everywhere. as a really broad, basic answer. But I think honestly, it's we still start to see it. thinking of like the TBX project, for example. I didn't know a lot about that until really working through the film project and thinking about how does something like that, for example, recreate the same issue of I-275 coming right through downtown Tampa, right? And if it's going to parallel, and if really it's generally intended to expedite travel from suburbia to downtown, how does that work in terms of who will be displaced to increase that traffic, the speed of traffic, right? Who's the beneficiary? Who loses in the process? So I think the more that we can know about structural issues that are happening, right, and systemic laws and things that are in place, when we really start to, I think when we take a willing dive into understanding, and I think that's on the part of each person who has the willingness to want to look in the mirror and think about how do all of these processes work together. Generally, it's in favor of one group and to the detriment of another group. And we've historically seen that is generally in favor of the white majority population, or what's perceived as the white majority, versus people of color. And so I think having those conversations, those really hard conversations, is an important first step on, I think, on how people in Tampa and just, I think, in the US in general, can start to learn if they have the willingness to make that sort of deep dive.
All right. Well, as we transition to Angela, then helping us to fill questions from the participants, I just want to personally say thank you for having the courage and the determination to putting together such an informational and educational film. And again, kudos to you, and we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you, Dr. Phil.
No, thank you. And I'll just follow up to say, I mean, it was a journey. It was a journey. It was a struggle to, I think, ultimately try to tell the lived story, right? And I think so often we get a mediated version, and I think even every story that we get is informed by different places that we find information. So I appreciate you saying that, because that was my biggest goal in this, and it's what I try to teach my students, especially who want to be filmmakers, is start from the point of the lived experience and try as best as you can to capture it through that lens, and that is what I hope gives it an authenticity, even though it is still an organized, edited piece. That ultimately I was the one that sort of constructed the holistic story. It was really a journey of learning for me. So I just want to say thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
And we do have a question from Joe Humphrey. He is an 8th grade history teacher, by the way. He wanted to know, he said there are a lot of threads brought together here, but is there one specific area of this documentary that you wish you could have explored a little bit further?
Ooh, that's a good question. Right, I can't give the cop out and say all of it. But I think, let me think. I think maybe 2 parts. If I just sort of a quick answer, I think one would be sort of the even more of the inner working conversations between, for example, Perry Harvey and Jim Hammond and the Longshoreman group, like sort of the the Black elite conversation and the white elite conversation, like to be more privy to those behind the scenes conversation beyond just documents I was able to read that are in the Bob Saunders archives, for example, in the USF Library, or those that are at the Robert Saunders Library in Tampa, right? So I think that would be one, would be that inner working of those conversations that are sort of heralded as the Tampa Technique, but also maybe we're part of the problem in slowing the process. And so just like trying to get in the back door of those negotiated conversations to really learn more about that. I think that's probably number one. And I think even more, just I would have loved to have tried to give more of the personal story of who Martin Chambers was. Right, in the era of social media now, and obviously in good and bad ways, good to share information, but bad in terms of we immediately know who someone who is shot and killed. Right, we know Michael Brown. Right, we know Freddie Gray. Right, we know Jacob Blake even is living. Right, George Floyd. Like, we know the names, and then I was even just watching a TED Talk last night with Kimberly Crenshaw, who's well known for like intersectional research, and her emphasis is on all of the lives of Black women who have been killed by police in the last few years, and how their sort of identities are lost in media. Like, trying to unpack a little more of that lost identity of who Martin Chambers was is one thing that I've always been interested in, just sort of knowing a little more about who he is beyond what I've been, what I've read in 40th and 50th anniversary news stories.
And that is something that is very interesting, because I heard that story a while back, and it does bring a point to me in the film, something that Arthenia Joyner said. She was talking about how the responsibility should be on the people for us to speak to people who lived in that era. And you called out some names, which one of the, with Joe Humphrey, he was in the Q&A, was typing some of the names that were brought up, like Perry Harvey and C. Blythe Andrews and Reverend Lowry and James Hammond, and how James Hammond just recently died, I think less than a year ago. And so it's very interesting that a lot of these names, I'm kind of shameful, but a lot of these names, I know them. The Andrews family, the Harvey family, they lived on my street. Like, I grew up on River Grove where they all lived, and I never knew this history. And even Mr. Hammond, Reverend Lowry, married, my aunt and uncle. Like, they were the ones who married. He was the one who married. So for me not to know this history is shameful. Like, I really feel bad, and really just like Ms. Joyner said, Arthenia Joyner said, the responsibility is for us to talk. And so now that I've watched your documentary, I've been talking to people and sharing the story and sharing your documentary, and like literally going on there and sharing it and sending it to people so that they understand some of the history of Tampa and how a lot of the people that we know are family members. I don't know if many people know, but Doretha Edgecombe is my aunt. And so my mother grew up with her, so my mom knows this history. And for me not to know it is just shameful. Like, I feel really horrible, but that is the reason why I'm so passionate. I feel like after watching your documentary, I learned so much. And Dr. Houghton, who's one of the panelists on here, she said that thank you for bringing clarity to a portion of our foundation, because I grew up here, and to know how, that interstate, like she was saying, her mother once told her about that, but we don't know all the details. And so I thank you for bringing that to us and allowing us to be able to ask questions. And, what was it like during those times? I know there were some people on there who talked about it, but there's someone, how can we access this documentary in order to share? If I missed it in the beginning. Okay, no, we did not, but it is found on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And sometimes PBS plays it. I know that's what Dr. Bell, you and I talked about. You want it played other months besides just February, Black History Month. Like, it should be played throughout the year. Like, this is just the history of Tampa. And So I can put the link out. What I'll try to do is I'll put the link in here while Dr. Lewis, if you have something to say, I'll put the link to the video. And also, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'll also send the link to the video to all of the participants and the ones who registered and did not attend. I'll send the actual link to be able to view, and then on there you'll see a share on YouTube where you can just share and send it to whoever you like. So you're welcome.
And to your point, Angela, I'd like to also let Dr. Bell know that Angela and I will be co-facilitating a session on the Florida Department of Education's Connect, Learn, and Share panel on this coming Thursday. And so with one of the slides, we are planning to highlight that we started off our Black History Month 4-part series with your documentary. So through that means we'll also be sharing with a lot of our family community engagement supervisors and leaders throughout the entire state of Florida. So that will be also another platform for us to share this information with some of our colleagues throughout the state.
Nice. The it's interesting as you were both talking about Ms. Joyner, Ms. Edgecombe. I think one thing that was interesting for me about halfway through the project was a recognition that I was missing a lot of female voices. And I think that's going back to Dr. Lewis, to your question earlier about maybe what some people might learn from watching the film, or just even start thinking through, right? It was sort of a reflexive look at halfway through the film. Like I'm literally, other than Dr. Cheryl Rodriguez, I didn't have any other female voices in the film. And I think that's a lot of the lost narrative of the civil rights movement generally, is an overwhelming emphasis on who were the male figures sort of leading the charge, at least in the history books, and what names sort of carry through, with the exception of Rosa Parks, you generally don't get a lot of information education on who were a lot of key leaders. And I think that's one thing that was really interesting. But to your point about it, thinking of it through the lens of education, that space has been historically so largely occupied by female educators. And so trying to think of like that interesting intersection of like all those foundational people that Dr. Joyner is talking about, from growing up in Tampa and from the schools and being sort of the motivators to participate. Like those voices, I think, are so critical to make sure that we continue to get in and to reemphasize I can't reemphasize the importance of education and talking through these complex issues at younger ages, middle school and high school, to start to get this knowledge into kids, to really start to understand the history of where and how and why a lot of what we're seeing now through social platforms. Why are we seeing these sort of what Dr. Prince talks about in the film, these like sort of overt outbursts, and it's because of understanding the history and continuing to see it be a continuous cyclical problem. So just a couple of other sort of general observations from the film itself.
I have another question here. It says, Fannie Lou Hamer once said, "The strange thing to me was that everybody that would compromise in 5 minutes is the people with real good education." The question is, what limitations, if any, do you perceive took place because of efforts to restore calm after the uprising as opposed to creating systematic change?
That's a good question. I think what's interesting too is and I don't think it's not in the film, but there's sort of a cutout that comes up across the screen about the weather and what was going on. And in talking or in learning through the process, when Martin Chambers was killed, there was, sort of revolt in the streets right in and around Central Avenue. And then there was a thunderstorm that came through that they thought the police thought sort of scattered people. And so they were almost reliant on the weather to be a deterrent. And then then people came back. And at that point, it seemed like it was a slow response from police and law enforcement. But then there was that quick negotiation with, at least my understanding of Jim Hammond and the White Hats. And it's a really hard question to answer, right? Because like, what's the hypothetical if it didn't continue or if it did? There's actually a researcher at University of Texas who's fascinated with the White Hats that I've been in communication with, and he's really trying to unpack kind of that role, like, right, what happened with the civility of who helped stop things, and instead, why not let it continue? To really exemplify that there was a problem. So I don't know that I fully answered the question, partially because it's a complex, right? It's complex to offer hypotheticals on historical accounts, but I think it's helpful to try to learn from them more in the present, because we could always sort of play the armchair quarterback approach. To like, well, what if you would have done this? What would the outcome have been? And right now, I think it's more important for us to understand what happened and how it happened, and think through the structures and the systemic issues that led to the eventual demise of Central Avenue. And we see this has played out, in countless number of cities all across the country. Right? There's Overtown in Miami. I learned about Yamacraw and Savannah when I was up there. I just forgot the name of it. There's one in Durham, right? But we learned about all these different places that were displaced through the same systemic, routinized structural problems. So it's almost like you could put Central Avenue in a different city, call it a different name, and the outcome was the same. So I think it's important for us to know and start to see a lot of these linkages that are happening, that lead to a lot of the issues. So I hope I at least partially answered the question. I apologize. I feel like I went off a little tangential there.
No, not at all. Well, I don't think we have any more questions, but so I just wanted to really thank you, Dr. Bell. Again, that was a wonderful documentary, and I learned all about it. Now I know what the Tampa Technique is. Yes.
I think Dr. Houghton has a question.
Oh, Dr. Houghton, you have a question. Go ahead and ask your question.
You have my video off.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I wanted to, Dr. Bell, I wanted to say it was awesome listening to you, but Angela, I want to tell you something that you said, so don't feel bad. When there was a movie that came on TV, it's called Mississippi Burning.
Mm-hmm.
It actually took place, they filmed the whole movie in South Carolina, not far, okay, just a second. Yeah, not far from where my dad's land is in South Carolina. My aunts wanted to be in the movie. They wouldn't let them be in the movie. There's a particular reason. They actually built the structure and they burned down the church and the house and everything. But when I saw the movie, I asked my mom, why wasn't she watching it with me? And why didn't she tell me all about this history? And I remember we lived in New York when Martin Luther King died, and we got all of these books and ebony magazines about him. She said, I lived it and it didn't feel good. And I didn't want you to know about it. So I didn't tell you. It wasn't something that she wanted to rehearse.
Mm-hmm.
The older I get, I crave that history because I want to know. And she didn't do it intentionally, but our parents did a disservice to us by not telling us that history so we can build on it. But it was painful for them at that particular time. Mm-hmm. So that's why our parents didn't say stuff. But for Angela, in your case, you got a couple of people in your family that's still living. You guys need to tape them and to get more. Arthena Joyner, Miss Edgecombe, your mother, they were all educators in the system. Dr. Brinson, and I bring up some of them because we talk about segregation, Ms. Edgecombe talked about it's one thing what the interstates did, and there's not that community anymore. And there's a segment of our population of kids, like nobody has control. Back then, it wasn't like that. So we all took care of each other. So the interstate, some of the things that were done by design actually put the Black race in reverse. We didn't move ahead. And if you listen to some of what the people in the movie said, Dr. Bell, I just love your documentary. I hope you do more. And here's what's sad is that you brought out some rich history. I think Tampa will be better for it if we would listen to it, understand it, and then take that as a foundation and move forward. That's it. I can go on all night. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Well, thank you. I think it's interesting you touched on sort of the lived experience and who, right? Well, first, who is still with us to help tell it, right? And I have those moments where I'm like, if I could go back, like if I could have a time machine right now and go meet Bob Saunders, I think he would probably be first of someone just in my readings of and reading his papers and diving into a lot of his archival material that's in the USF Special Collections. Like he's one, if I could go back and talk to him, would be like an ultimate experience. Reverend Lowry is another one who I know has been spoken highly of. They're just two, right? But like thinking of, and you know, Mr. Hammond passed, I think it was about a year and a half ago. And I constantly, when I see the film, I reflect on the chance to get to have talked to him for, you know, an hour and a half and just like hear his sort of raw interpretations of what it was like. But there are those who have lived it who don't want to talk about it.
Right.
And that's the sense that I got from Martin Chambers' family. His two people from his family came to the public screening that I had the day before the anniversary of his death. And they, about 3 minutes before the film, came in, introduced themselves, and I said, you know, I was hoping to have someone from your family's voice in the film. You know, two things. I would love to know what you think after it's done. And second, here's my card. If you are interested and or want to do an interview, I can re-edit this film to make sure that there's a place for that. Unfortunately, I didn't hear any sort of follow-up, but I also understand because that lived experience is raw and it's real, and to continue to re-articulate what it's like to have lost someone so young as part of your family. I can only imagine the challenge, right? And then even thinking through, and I'll leave you all. I could talk about this all day, just because it's become like a passion project to, I think, share the story. But even learning of the loss of Marshall High School, for example, in Plant City, as the third segregated high school in Hillsborough County, right? And there's so much rich history about Middleton and Blake because they're back, not in the same form and fashion, right? But they're back and are celebrated in learning about the role of education and sort of the restructuring and reconfiguring of who went to what school and where. I learned just a very brief story about Marshall High School being the third segregated high school in Hillsborough County out in Plant City. And I think that's another one of those stories that should be told. That's in the back of my mind as another project to want to do, is sort of the reclamation story of Marshall High School. I literally don't know much about it, but I know it existed. And I think that's an important artifact to think through the lens of, like, why is that story important? Well, because it's the same level as Middleton and Blake. It just doesn't have the historical celebration that comes from both of those schools, and fewer people who are still associated with it. So there's a lot of these stories, I think, in and around the Tampa Bay area. just in the Tampa Bay area, right? That a lot of stories are untold, and it'd be helpful to think through that process.
Dr. Berry mentioned something, so I wanted to say this, and I saw it in the chat. I wasn't going to bring it up. What happened during the film of Mississippi Burning, on my dad's side of the family, it was my aunts. They were too light-skinned, so they wanted to be a part of the church scene, and they would not allow them in the movie because their skin tone was not the right color. So of course, we had really upset family members. So just wanted to clarify that. They wanted to be, they were just the wrong skin tone, wrong hue.
Also, I noticed, I never spoke with Mr. Hammond personally, but based on the interviews, to me, he was a little bit more, I feel, so, and I want to just get your opinion, Dr. Bell, was he a little bit more radical than the rest of them? Okay. That was my sense, that he was a little bit more.
Oh, Angela, that was me. Me be quiet.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. It's a panel discussion. So well, if you know him, you can interject. Like, out of all the people that you interviewed, was he the most radical, would you say, or had a lot more forward thinking because he put together the white hats?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? The term radical is such a unique term, because I also think of what, like, Clarence Ford, the way that he approached the sit-in movement, for example, was very radical, because where the majority of stories came out about lunch counter sit-ins were largely HBCU students, right, who on their own made these collective decisions as 19, 20, 21-year-olds to participate in sit-ins, right? And so the Greensboro Four, like learning about that and knowing the story of the Greensboro Four and seeing how it's been documented, learning that, Clarence Ford was sort of a Tampa outsider and was in this area, but motivated by the Greensboro Four to then go to, like, I think about going to the student body presidents at two high schools that you're not affiliated with and asking high school students, hey, by the way, what do you guys think about joining me at this lunch counter sit-in thing? Like, don't tell your parents, don't tell anyone, just meet me there. And even though Mr. Ford's presentation, his delivery style doesn't come off as radical, I think about everything that he did, and to hear him speak on different things that he's done to push boundaries, like, he is a fascinating, wonderful human being to have learned from, and still having seen him. And this is a complete aside, but the marker that is now in downtown Tampa, right by where the Woolworth was, to celebrate Mr. Ford and the lunch counter sit-in movement. One of my old colleagues from Channel 10 had Tammy Fields she got her master's degree in digital journalism from the USF St. Pete campus, and learned of this and made it her sort of pet project mission to have a marker there to acknowledge the work that Mr. Ford and everyone did in that moment, and to have been there, like, when they revealed it, and to see it, and like, those types of things are just, the more that knowledge can be shared, and the more that the public acknowledgements can happen, I think helps to start to situate the history at least a little more, even if it's a small sliver. It starts to help in the educational process of who should learn about, all movements, and the significance of them, and the people who were the ones leading that charge. So, but Mr. Hammond it was an amazing experience to talk to him, because he had sort of very pointed history of Tampa being a racist space, and thinking through of being sort of the one, sort of Black City official in his role, and thinking of what he did in that moment in that singular capacity was also fascinating. So, yeah, just hearing the lived experience is still something that will resonate with me forever. Just in the making of this film, and thinking through even how much had to be edited out that I would have liked to have put in, but at some point you have to keep it cohesive, because I can't show like 14 hours of interviews. I could, but I don't think someone will watch a 14-hour documentary of it. So try to make it in a more digestible, hopefully educational product. Best way I can think of it.
Well, thank you so much. And again, Dr. Travis Bell, author of The Tampa Technique, The Rise, Demise, and Remembrance of Central Avenue. So blessed to have you here. So with that, I want to thank everybody for staying on. I know it's Power Hour, but we had to push through another extra time to have this wealthy, healthy discussion, and join us. This is a 4-part series. Join us next week when we will talk about who is George Edgecombe. So it'll be the same time, 6 p.m. Monday night. Come be with us. And for all of you for sticking with us, thank you, and have a blessed evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Angela?
Yes.